So years ago, so I'm 60, so I'm old, right? And years ago when I was in college, 4 decades ago, long time ago, folks, when I was not as bright and as handsome as I am today. So I had a required class in business management. And so I thought, this is great. I like business and I'm interested in the topic. And so we went through various topics that were related at the time to what's taking place in business. One of the topics was affirmative action. Okay, so I can feel some of you already a little triggered, even as I said that word. So the topic was affirmative action, and the instructor was going over the idea that the idea behind affirmative action was to correct past social injustices as relates to certain minority groups that had maybe been overlooked for jobs, even though they were equally qualified, they'd been overlooked for jobs because of their ethnicity, okay? And so I was thinking about it because they were talking about, this could take a while, and it's sort of a social experiment to see if this is something that's going to, work. And I've always been sort of a meritocracy kind of a guy. In other words, if I have a brain surgeon, I want the best brain surgeon. I don't want somebody just checking a box, I guess. So anyway, in my audacity, we were having a debate back and forth with the instructor, and I said, prepare yourselves. I said, how long will I have to pay for the past sins of my fathers as relates to work? And this lady of color stood up in her chair and screamed at me from across the room, as long as it takes. I was canceled in that moment because they were all on her side. It was pre-internet cancellation. I think I got a C in the class, but I didn't get beat up, so that's good. So I didn't tell you that story to trigger you, and I hope I didn't. The purpose of the story is to say that we are, in fact, living in a time where we are cautious about what we say for fear of retribution. And one of the questions we should ask ourselves as followers of Christ, as people of the way, people who are trying to daily live more ethically, more morally, more God-honoring lives, the thing that we should be asking ourselves is, are we shying away from saying what we believe to be truth? Are we self-filtering where God is concerned? And if so, should we be doing that? And are there times when we should self-filter as relates to God? In other words, are we too pushy? Or are there other times when we really should have said something to God, about God and we didn't say it? Our founders were very wise. Our First Amendment is, of course, one of the most cherished of all of the things that our founding fathers could have given to us. And I just want to read it just as a reminder. It says this: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That's us. And everybody else who wants to worship God in the way that they see fit. Or abridging the freedom of speech. In other words, stopping someone or causing someone to have to say things a certain way. Or of the press. The press is free to say about anything that they pretty much want to say, as long as it's not illegal. Or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. We should be profoundly grateful for our founding fathers and the wisdom that it took to say that there may be people around us, in our circles or in our communities or in our nation, that are going to say things that are profoundly offensive to us, and we cherish their right to say those awful things in the same way that we would ask that they would cherish our right to say the things that we believe to be true. Now, to be sure, the courts have ruled on what we can't say. So you can't go into a movie theater and say, there's a fire, unless there's a fire. You can't do that. You can't get on an airplane and say, I've got a bomb on me. You can't do that. So there are certain things that you cannot say, and the courts have ruled on that. But the question for us today has really been turned around a little bit, which is the question of what can be said or what has to be said by us. What language do we have to use? What do we have to self-filter out? And if not, what are the risks associated or the consequences associated with not following the new rules, if you will? So maybe you feel like you've been tiptoeing around certain people, certain groups of people. Happens in families, of course. You got an uncle who's highly opinionated, or your mom is overbearing, or got a little brother or a little sister who's just annoying as they can be. So maybe you tiptoe around certain people. But really, the question for us this morning is: are we modifying our language about God because we're concerned about the audience that is listening to us? Are you afraid of potential violence if you say something that is unpopular, even if it is true? And so that's kind of where we pick up the story with the Apostle Paul today. Paul's on his third missionary journey. He's nearing the end of it. And he has gone back to Rome. We've seen this over the course of many, many chapters of Acts. The first third of the book of Acts is primarily about Peter and John's ministry, and the second two-thirds of the book is primarily about the Apostle Paul's journey, his conversion, the success he's had in establishing churches in Asia Minor and so forth. So Paul's wanting to go to Jerusalem. He wants to go home to family, if you will. He wants to be back around his people, and he wants to tell all the good things that have happened in these Gentile areas and how what their conversion has looked like. And in addition to all that, he has brought a monetary gift to the Church of Jerusalem that is struggling greatly. So we saw last time we were in Acts that Paul has arrived, and not only has Paul arrived, but the canceling crew has kind of arrived with Paul as well. And the rumors are on Paul that he doesn't respect the temple of God. And that's a big deal. That's in certain instances of disrespect to the temple, it is something that is worthy of death. He is teaching, presumably, Jewish people who want to convert to Christianity, not Gentile, but Jewish people who want to convert to Christianity. He's teaching them, presumably, that they don't have to be circumcised, that they don't have to follow the law of Moses, that they don't essentially have to be Jewish in order to be Christian. And that's creating quite a stir in Jerusalem, which is all Jewish. And so James, the half-brother of Jesus, is in charge of the church at Jerusalem. Peter and John are off on their own missionary journees. And so Paul comes and he wants to talk with James and see and report all these things and essentially share what Paul sees as the joy of what's taking place in these Gentile areas. Well, James has heard all of these reports as well before Paul gets there. And you may recall last week that James says, look, Paul, essentially, this is a very loose paraphrase, we need to smooth things out. We need to smooth things out with some of the local people, because here's what's taking place. They all think that you're doing this. So here's what I think you should do, Paul. I think you should take a vow. And at the end of that 7-day vow, Nazirite vow, which is a time of penitence and a time of confession and a time of reconciliation, all these different types of themes that are taking place during this 7-day period of time. I think you should do that. And then by doing that, all of the Jewish folks in this area who think that you're no longer behaving like a Jew, they will realize that, Paul, you're not really saying that Jewish people don't have to honor the temple or don't have to be circumcised their young male boys. You're not saying that at all, Paul. You're one of us, Paul. So Paul, I think in a moment of, well, it's my opinion, in a moment of weakness, I think Paul says to himself, I'm going to go along to get along. And we do that too, don't we? With our speech sometimes, we go along to get along. We don't really say what's on our mind. We'll talk more about that in just a few moments. But he says, okay, I'll do that. I'll go along to get along, but it doesn't satisfy those who have come to accuse Paul. And that's where we pick up the story in Acts chapter 21, beginning in verse 27. So when the 7 days were nearly over, this is that vow that Paul had taken, some Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple. By the way, Paul had trouble everywhere he went when he was planting churches, especially with Jewish people. They stirred up the whole crowd and seized him. And I want you to pay attention. I've underlined some of the words along the way in this particular passage. And I want you to see how it is that when people begin to get emotional and dogmatic about their positions, about what they understand to be the right thing to do, how they can stop listening and how they sometimes resort to violence. They stirred up the whole crowd and seized him. So they went around, they said, this is what Paul is doing. We've done that, we've seen that. Hopefully we haven't done that. We've seen that before where people go around and they're stirring up trouble for us. They're causing trouble for us for whatever reason. They got an axe to grind or they don't understand what we're talking about. They stirred up a whole crowd and seized him, shouting, fellow Israelites, help us. This is a man who teaches everyone, everywhere. Okay, huge hyperbole there. Against our people and against our law and this place. So they're hearkening to their traditions. They're hearkening to their sense of being God's chosen people, and that Paul shouldn't really be telling fellow Jews that they don't have to follow the Old Testament restrictions and honor the temple and so forth. Everyone, everywhere against our people and our law and this place, meaning the temple. And besides, he has brought Greeks, that's Gentiles, into the temple and defiled this holy place, which isn't true, as we read. They had previously seen Trophimus, the Ephesian, in the city with Paul and assumed that Paul had brought him into the temple. So what do we have so far? We have people who don't have the right story. They don't have the correct information. They don't want to hear the correct information. They're already at a point of shouting. They're stirring up other people to do the same thing as they are doing. And then they're making assumptions about what the Apostle Paul is doing. Doesn't that sound a little bit like what we see in modern social media? Part of the story. Maybe part of it is true. Maybe none of it is true. Maybe all of it is true. But the point is that sounds like an old term. They're rabble rousers, right? They're looking for a conflict. They're looking for trouble. They're looking for an us against them. They want to be a part of a certain group. And that group believes they're on the right side. And they'll do whatever it takes to silence those who they believe are on the wrong side. Verse 30, the whole city was aroused. That's probably Luke's hyperbole, but it is for sure something that would have gotten around. The Apostle Paul's in town. And the people came running from all directions. Again, that reminds me of when we were in grade school and you hear about fight, 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 right? And everybody comes running from everywhere because we want to see the first punch thrown, right? And we used to, as children, egg them on. Hit him, hit him, hit him. He said this about you. She said that about you, right? Even if it wasn't true. Whole city was aroused and people came running from all directions, seizing Paul. They put hands on him. They dragged him from the temple. So in other words, he went unwillingly. And immediately the gates were shut because they couldn't give him a good beating inside the temple. They had to take him outside. While they were trying to kill him, so we've moved from words to absolute violence. News reached the commander of the Roman troops. The whole city of Jerusalem was in an uproar. Okay, so the Roman troops would have been in greater force because it was a time of one of the Jewish celebrations. And so the Romans knew that sometimes during these large celebrations, people were excitable and their emotions were involved. And so they would send in extra troops to sort of keep the peace in the same way that we would do if we had a large gathering of any kind. We would add additional law enforcement. He at once, meaning the commander, took some officers and soldiers, ran down to the crowd. When the rioters saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul because you didn't want to get on the wrong side of Rome. Even if you thought Paul had it coming, you didn't want to get on the wrong side of Rome. They didn't do well with public rioting. Verse 33, the commander came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. Then he asked who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd, okay, commander's asking Paul, not the crowd. Some in the crowd shouted one thing and some another. And since the commander could not get at the truth because of the uproar, he ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. When Paul reached the steps, so I don't know how important it is, but it was actually just adjacent to the temple, and there was this stairway that led up to where the Roman garrison would have been. So Paul's going up this set of steps, okay? Where did I leave off? Thank you. 33, wasn't it? 35, thank you. You know you're in trouble when the crowd has to tell you where you're at. You're not going to get violent with me, are you, if I say we were in 33? Just kidding. All right. 35, when Paul reached the steps, the violence of the mob was so great that he had to be carried by the soldiers. We've seen things like that. Have you seen people who are just coming to talk? Maybe it's at a college campus, maybe it's at a public forum of some kind, and they're there just to share their thoughts. And even if they were the worst thoughts in the world, they have the right to say what they want to say, as long as they don't incite violence and do the things that Supreme Court has already ruled upon. And yet we see time and time again, especially in modernity, that these individuals who aren't promoting violence or otherwise, they have to be protected by a large group of law enforcement in order to just move, because because of their words, they want to enact violence on them. So when Paul reaches the steps, the violence of the mob was so great he had to be carried by the soldiers. The crowd that followed kept shouting, "Get rid of him." They were all in. They didn't want to hear anything that Paul had to say. So as the soldiers were about to take Paul into the barracks, he asked the commander, "May I say something to you?" The commander was sort of surprised because he didn't expect Paul to be speaking his language. He said, "Do you speak Greek?" He replied. "Aren't you the Egyptian who had started a revolt and led 4,000 terrorists out into the wilderness some time ago?" That's kind of a sidebar story, but it was an interesting one. There was actually a person that was causing trouble in Jerusalem and was an antagonist, and he was an Egyptian, and he had led 4,000 out into the desert. They were ultimately dealt with by Rome, and essentially the leadership was decapitated, if you will. Okay, verse 39, Paul answered, "I am a Jew from Tarsus of Cilicia, a citizen of no ordinary city. Please let me speak to the people." Notice how Paul, he doesn't shout back, does he? He says, "Please, let me talk to the people." After receiving the commander's permission, Paul stood on the steps, so he's up above the crowd, and Paul was never one to want to miss a crowd. Remember at Ephesus, he had a crowd of 25,000 people who wanted to kill him, and he still said, I got to tell about Jesus. So a little bit ill-advised. After receiving the commander's permission, Paul stood on the steps and motioned to the crowd. When they were all silent, he said to them in Aramaic. Other translations say that Hebraic, that he spoke to them in their native language. Chapter 22, "Brothers and fathers, listen now to my defense." Listen. Isn't that a key to how we are going to get past some of these issues rather than jumping to immediate judgment on things? Isn't it just a matter of listening to somebody you really think you're not going to like, but they may have something to say? He said, they said, when he heard him speak in Aramaic, they became very quiet. Then Paul said, "I am a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, brought up in the city. I studied under Gamaliel." So Gamaliel, he was a well-known teacher in Jerusalem. To get into his school was a big deal. You had to be the best of the best, the most devout and devoted and educated of Jewish people to get into his school. So essentially Paul is saying, here are my credentials. I'm a Jew just like you. I'm a Jew of Jews. I'm one of the best of Jews. And was thoroughly trained in the law of our ancestors. I was just as zealous for God as any of you are today. He identifies with him. He says, look, I was you. I persecuted the followers of the way to their death, arresting both men and women and throwing them into prison, as the high priest and all the council can themselves testify. I even obtained letters from them to their associates in Damascus and went there to bring these people as prisoners to Jerusalem and be punished. That's why Paul was on the road to Damascus when he has his conversion. Verse 6, about noon, as I came near Damascus, suddenly a bright light from heaven flashed around me. I fell to the ground, heard a voice saying to me, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" Paul's giving his testimony. He's saying, this is what happened to me. This is why I am the way I am. See if it's not rational or reasonable or something or punch holes in it if you want to. But at least let's have a dialogue is what Paul is essentially saying. "Who are you, Lord?" I asked. "I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting." He replied, My companions saw the light, but they did not understand the voice of him who was speaking to me. "What shall I do, Lord?" I asked. "Get up," the Lord said, "and go into Damascus. There you will be told all that you have been assigned to do." My companions led me by the hand into Damascus, because of the brilliance of the light had blinded me. A man named Ananias, not the high priest Ananias, which is coming up, but a man named Ananias came to see me. So here's another, you ever had to put references on your resume? Here's another reference on your resume. Gamaliel, now he's saying Ananias. He's a devout guy. He was a devout observer of the law and highly respected by all the Jews living there. He stood beside me and said, "Brother Saul, receive your sight." At that very moment, I was able to see him. Then he said, "The God of our ancestors has chosen you to know his will and to see the righteous one and to hear the words from his mouth." I think we need to pause there for a moment. If you are here today as a follower of Christ, it is because, to a certain extent, God has chosen you. God has chosen you he's chosen all of us to hear from him, but he's chosen you uniquely for your gifts and your talents and your skills and your willingness to listen to impact your world where it is that he would have for you to serve. And Ananias sees that. You will be, verse 15, you will be his witness to all the people of what you have seen and heard. And now, what are you waiting for? Right? Get busy. Get up, be baptized, wash your sins away, calling on his name. Verse 17, when I returned to Jerusalem and I was praying at the temple, I fell into a trance. I saw the Lord speaking to me. "Quick," he said, "leave Jerusalem immediately, because the people here will not accept your testimony about me." They won't listen. They won't listen. And pay attention to that, because in a moment we're going to talk about the fact that there are times that people simply will not listen. It could be that you've been polite. It could be that you've been courteous. It could be that you've done everything in your power to be a peacemaker in that situation, and they still won't listen. Verse 19. "Lord," I replied, "these people know that I went from one synagogue to another to imprison and beat those who believe in you. And when the blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, I stood there giving my approval and guarding the clothes of those who were killing him." That's all the way back early in Acts. You may recall that. Verse 21, "Then the Lord said to me," so Paul's trying to say, "Are you sure you want me, God?" It's kind of like Moses, where Moses says, "God, I would love to help, but I stutter. So I really can't do this job. Choose somebody else." And Paul was kind of in the same boat. He's like, "Are you sure you want me? Because are they really going to accept me?" Then the Lord said to me, "Go, I will send you far away to the Gentiles." Now that seems innocuous enough. Paul, I'm going to send you to the Gentiles. But then we read the next sentence. Listen to their response. The crowd listened to Paul until he said this. This was the triggering moment for that Jewish crowd. Then they raised their voices and shouted, "Rid the earth of him. He's not fit to live." Can you imagine having just your words, the things that you say, or the thoughts that you have, or even the things that you hold to be of value, so offensive to somebody that they would be willing to say, "You don't deserve to live," because of your words? Not because of your actions, but because of your words. And I'm fearful today that we have a lot of people who would say such things, certainly behind the mask of the social media, where you can presumably sort of hide if you want to, and you can sort of troll people and mistreat people in any way that you want to treat them. But to say about somebody that their words were manifestly strong enough that they were no longer worthy to live is shocking to me, shocking. So it really brings me to a couple of points of application and a few questions. First question is this. Is there a time, scripturally speaking, is there a time when you or I shouldn't speak up? Is there a time when we really shouldn't speak up? Whether it's with our faith or with just our general character and nature. Solomon said in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, he said this, "There is a time to be silent and a time to speak." So there is something to be said for silence. And we'll find out why in just a moment. Now, Paul was an optimist, I think, to believe that he could convince these people, knowing everything he knew about what their charges were against him and how the crowd was already riled up. I think Paul was an optimist, believing that he could convince these people. He maybe should have been silent. Jesus, for sure, could have stopped his trial. He could have stopped his beating. He could have stopped his execution with a single word. This is the same Jesus who calms the storm and says, "Quiet, be still." Jesus could have said, "No, you're not going to beat me. No, you're not going to crucify me." But he didn't, because his mission was different than what we would have thought. Someone once said this, "When you don't know enough about a situation or other people are experts, or when your opinion has no impact on others, it is often better to stay silent, just because it is the wisest thing to do. Silence is the best answer to someone who doesn't value your words." There are some people, it's like kicking against the goads, as the Bible says. There are some people that we should not waste our time on. There's value in knowing when it is best to speak and when it is best to be silent. It may require spending a moment, say, "Lord, what would you want me to do in this situation?" Because every fiber of my being wants to speak. And God may tell you to be silent. So those are times when you shouldn't speak up. How about times when you should speak up? Yeah, there are times when you should speak up, for sure. Inc. magazine has at least 5 that are related to just normal kinds of interactions, relational interactions that we have with one another. The first is this, that silence, if we don't speak up, that silence is deemed as approval. Right? So if you don't say something, it's like, okay, well, I guess I agree with that. In other words, the default is, if you don't say something, whoever's doing the talking assumes that you're with them. The second thing they say is, the greater good should be the priority. Sometimes we do things that are expedient, right? We do things that are going to calm over the situation or smooth over the situation, but the long game is sacrificed for that. So there are times when we should speak up if there's a greater good, and that greater good is the priority. And then they go on to say, demonstrate you're invested. In other words, when you speak up, it shows that you agree, that you're on board, that you're part of the team, that you share the goal and the mission and whatever the case may be. And then they go on to say, you should speak up sometimes because no one else may know. You actually might be the expert in the room. You might even be shaking your head internally going, this ain't going to work. I know better. It's not going to work. And yet you don't say anything. Those are times when we should speak up, if you know better. And then finally, you may not be as alone as you think you are in your thinking. Sometimes we're just silent because we think that everybody else is in agreement. Nobody else is saying anything. Why do I want to rock the boat? So those are practical things from a relational standpoint of times when we should speak up. Someone once said this, there are times when you must speak, not because you're going to change the other person, but because if you don't speak, they have changed you. And that's true. More from a scriptural perspective, in Matthew chapter 10, verse 33, Jesus says this about us speaking to others about him. But whoever disowns me before others, I will disown before my Father in heaven. So if somebody asks you what you believe, or what it is, where your faith comes from, and you stumble and you are fearful of their reaction, that's a big concern. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15, Peter instructs the dispersed church. He says this. He says, but in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience, so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander. Do it in gentleness. Do it in patience, long-suffering, forbearance, all parts of the fruit of the Spirit. But speak. And then finally, just a few verses before that, in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 9, it says, do not repay evil with evil, or insult with insult. On the contrary, repay evil with blessing. Isn't that counterintuitive? How many of us really want to be nice to a jerk? None of us, right? None of us want to be nice to a person who's clearly offending everybody in the room, yourself included. He says, repay evil with blessing, because to this you were called so that you may inherit a blessing. It is, again, counterintuitive that when we do not retaliate, that somehow or other we are better off as a result of it. And just ask yourself, do you feel better after you retaliated? Maybe for a minute, but then you back up and you go, man, I wish I wouldn't have behaved that way. I wish I would have checked my emotions. I wish I would have checked my anger, right? So in all of these things, I think that we need to be concerned about what we can say, and we need to be concerned even more so about the things that may be coming to our generation that tell us what we have to say. There may be congressional action, sometime in the future. It seems to be the direction it's headed, that we will be compelled to say certain things. And if we're not willing to do that, then we may be facing consequences associated with that. I think God is calling us to speak the truth. He tells us to do it with kindness and with gentleness, to have some sense of discernment as to when we should speak and when we should not speak. We shouldn't take our liberty as license to indoctrinate every person that we come into contact with. But at the same time, we shouldn't avoid or abdicate, if that's the right word, our responsibilities to God and to our faith and to the way that we have adopted. And I think in doing that, we will live with a sense of self-awareness that allows us, with God's Spirit pouring through us, to make the right decisions on when we should speak, how we should speak, can we speak, and what are the things that we have to say. Let's pray together. Father, in these perilous times, we are often called to give an account of what we believe, especially about you. And so I pray that you would give us the wisdom in knowing when to speak and how to speak and what to speak, and that our convictions, that they might run so deep as to never abandon you before others. But may we also recognize when we are sharing our words with those who will not listen. In all this, may we bless you by not repaying evil for evil and receive a blessing in return. We would ask for your protection as we speak boldly, and show us what can and cannot be said. When our heads are bowed and eyes are closed, this is a time where we prepare our hearts for the symbolic nature of the Lord's Supper. It's a time where we come and we commune together, and we, more importantly, commune with our Father in heaven. And we recognize that although we're on a distant shore here, that one day we will be reunited. And this meal is a reminder of that. And it's a reminder of the covenant that God has made with us, this new covenant, a covenant of grace and of mercy and of acceptance and of adoption. And so before we take these communion elements together, I pray that each one of us would search our hearts. If there's something that is dishonoring to God or something we need to confess, I pray that we do that in these moments. And if you've yet to make a decision as to whether or not you will be a follower of Christ and to receive the free gift of salvation that he offers, his death upon a cross, that you might have everlasting life, I pray that you would allow the communion elements to pass. But I pray even more so that this would be the day that you actually make that decision for Christ. And the very first thing that you do after making that decision would be to be in fellowship, in communion with the Lord of your life, the one who's given his life for you.